I'm David Scobie. I'm the Executive Dean of the New School for General Studies, Milano, the New School for Management and Urban Policy, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this morning's forum on the Just City, Equality, Social Justice, and the Growing City, presented by the Milano School's Center for New York City Affairs. The division name that I just read out to you is a handful. We are a newly integrated division that brought together the Milano School with New School for General Studies. And we have many, kind of a sprawl of different programs and interests, but they're all held together by a common set of commitments and values to the interdisciplinary engagement of social issues and public culture, the integration of liberal learning, of academic learning, with civic, social, and political practice, all in the name of the democratic mission of higher education. The Milano School has a special role to play in that larger set of commitments. Through it, we train students for public service in government, in civil society, in private firms, in community organizations. And the Center for New York City Affairs within Milano exemplifies our commitments and values as well as anything in the division. The center does applied public research, and I would say public dissemination and convening of important conversations like this around the issue of how to strengthen communities, make government more effective, build diverse, strong, and equitable neighborhoods and communities within the metropolitan region and beyond. Today's center focuses on precisely these themes and values. How do we create a just city? How do we ensure that urban economic growth brings with it equity rather than growing forms of inequality? Our speaker, Susan Fainstein, whom Andrew White will introduce in a minute, is a wonderful leader and voice on these issues, someone from whom I've learned enormously over the years as a fellow urbanist, and I'm delighted that we're convening and hosting this forum. I want to thank Andrew, the director of the Center for New York City Affairs, and his staff for pulling together this program and the whole range of really important convenings, programs, reports on research, and projects that they do on behalf of the university and the city. I also want to thank the city's funders, especially the Milano Foundation and the Cirrus Fund, for enabling programs like this to take place. Susan Fainstein's presentation will be followed by a panel discussion, and there will be much time for question and answers and discussions. It's a compelling forum on an important topic, one that is committed to our overall mission of, as I would put it, putting learning in action for a just city. I'd like to ask Andrew White to come up and introduce Susan and the other panelists.
Thanks. Good morning. Feels like a very quiet morning. I'm not sure why. I guess it's just early. So I wanted to introduce things a little bit, give some context to why we're doing this. I mean, it may be entirely obvious to you, but I think when I picked up this book, it resonated pretty strongly with my work. And I think for 20 years, or maybe even more, I've been working among people and organizations who are trying to make this a better city for low-income and working-class people, whether through community development or workforce development, economic development, social services, healthcare, education, all the things that you all are among those doing the work. And I think the commitment to that work among many of us has been pretty visceral. You know, it's a question of sort of how do we do what's right, and not just make a living, but make this a more equitable city or a more just city. And in the process of that, I've learned that there are not that many easy solutions, particularly to poverty, but to many other issues as well. You know, even in a city that's been growing and improving in many ways over the last 20, 25 years, it was never clear at the moment what was necessarily the right thing to do. You know, and despite an idealist's desire to improve people's lives, you begin to realize that every decision doesn't necessarily have a wrong or a right side. There's you know, in every choice we make, there's the reality that policies and solutions don't invariably fall on one side that's righteous and one side that's not. I mean, sometimes they do, but often they don't. You think about neighborhood redevelopment and housing renovation, so much of which has happened since the late 80s in New York. On the face of it, it's a great thing. On the other hand, it's often led to displacement, gentrification, and pretty radical transformations of communities in which the community development organization involved didn't necessarily have that as their objective. They just wanted to improve the community. At the same time, when the mayor favors business growth and creates a lot of jobs, oftentimes that's it's obviously a good thing to have more jobs. There's often a downside, whether it's in the cost or in the quality of those jobs. You can even consider a favorite claim of our former mayor, Rudy Giuliani, who used to talk about how important the street crimes unit was, that it was reducing prevalence of drugs and guns in low-income neighborhoods and saving lives. At the same time, there was a serious cost to that in terms of the hostility and distrust for the police that it caused in so many of New York's neighborhoods. So my point here is that some of the best writers, both in academia and among practitioners, have dug deep on this in a philosophical way, trying to understand the complexities here and the contradictions. One of the best that I've read is this new book by Susan Fainstein, who we're going to hear from today. Professor Fainstein not only lays out the political and philosophical challenges for urban planners and policymakers, she also maps out some guideposts for justice in the city and justice in policymaking and planning. I find this book a tremendous help, and I hope this discussion will be able to dig deep and apply it to our work. After we hear her presentation, we'll have some time to discuss among an excellent panel, and with you as well, so think about questions as we go along. Susan Fainstein is Professor of Urban Planning at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. Previously, she was Professor of Urban Planning and Acting Director of the Graduate Program in Urban Planning at Columbia. Her teaching and research have long focused on the politics and economics of urban redevelopment, tourism, comparative urban and social policy, planning theory, issues of gender and planning. And the new book, The Just City, bridges progressive ideas of justice with the practical work of planners and urban policymakers. Please join me in welcoming Susan Fainstein to the New School.
Thank you. It's really good to be here, and thank you, Andrew, for this introduction. My husband, some of you may know, used to be Associate Dean of the Milano School, so I feel very close ties, in fact, to this institution, which has, since its inception, when Thorstein Veblen came here, been concerned with questions of justice. This book that Andrew referred to, The Just City, is one that I've been working on for a number of years, and perhaps for my whole life without actually knowing it. But it was only relatively recently that I tried to bring together my theoretical work with my empirical investigations in this particular way. I wanted to talk about what justice in the city might be. I realized that although I'd studied political theory in college and graduate school, I really had never studied formal philosophy. It is philosophers who try to determine what is the meaning of justice. And so I did what good students do, and I went to take a course, and I took that course in the New School because, to my surprise, when I was living in New York at the time, I was still at Columbia, I looked at the catalogs of all the various institutions available, and it was only the New School that had a course called Theories of Justice, taught by a very good German philosopher named Rainer Forst. So I took the course and became familiar with writing that I wouldn't otherwise have known about. So I attempted to develop first in the book a more or less abstract theory of what it means to talk about justice within the context, and I want to be very careful about the context which I was addressing, within the context of formally democratic wealthy societies. That is, I didn't even make an effort to say what would be justice when we're talking about Cairo or Mumbai. I think that's a very complicated question when you're talking about places at very low levels of resources without a democratic tradition, and I didn't feel capable of really addressing it. But I did think that I could look at the kinds of cities that I'd been looking at for most of my life and say what I meant by justice there, and I'll get in a minute to how I define justice. But there was a second, I guess I would say, ideological reason why I embarked on this research, which is that what we've seen in this country generally, and in New York City perhaps specifically, a triumph of what's come to be called neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a strange term within the American context because liberalism here, unlike in Europe, has always meant a kind of leftish viewpoint. But the term neoliberalism really refers to liberalism in its 18th century meaning, that is free markets, individualism, the limits on government, deregulation, saying in some sense every individual out for himself or herself, the triumph in a way of conservative market economics. I saw this ideological triumph as one that, and I'm certainly not original in saying this, that believed in growth above all things and devil take the hindmost. Although we have seen substantial growth in the United States in the last 40 years, really since the crisis of the middle 1970s, we have also seen widening inequality. The argument for growth is always that its benefits will trickle down, it will provide enough revenue so that governments can provide social services, but in fact that has largely not been the case. So my method in approaching the question of what do we mean by urban justice was first to examine some of the principal texts in political philosophy that address the question of what is justice. The problem with reading philosophy, which is very enlightening and enjoyable in many respects, because philosophers are very logical. They can't simply make assertions and leap to conclusions, but they really have to carefully follow a train of argument. But you're left, if you are a practitioner or even an empirical social scientist, with wondering, well, okay, so we've now agreed that justice constitutes whatever we agreed it did, but then what does that mean when we're actually out here trying to do something or to evaluate a policy? One of the philosophers I most admired was Iris Marion Young, who sadly died at quite a young age a few years ago. She is, as far as I know, the only philosopher to teach in an urban planning department. She taught in the planning department of the University of Pittsburgh. But once after a lecture she gave, I said, well, Iris, do you really think that this is practical in any city that you've ever heard of? And she said, well, I'm a philosopher. And that to me was not actually a sufficient answer. So I attempted then to start with these texts and then to derive principles that were applicable to urban planning and urban policy making. I did this in part through a kind of deductive process, but mainly through the examination of projects in New York, London, and Amsterdam. These are three cities that I have studied throughout my research career. Starting really, I wrote a paper with my husband Norman in 1978 that compared these three cities. At that time, I predicted that they would become more alike and that New York and London, well, New York in particular, would become more like the European social democratic cities. As it turns out, the European cities have become more like New York. So then I addressed these more specific questions within the context of these cities. How do we explain typical outcomes? That is, how do we explain that Amsterdam has in fact had a very substantial public housing programs really throughout the 20th century, as compared to New York or even London? And more, how do we evaluate the policies that are currently being framed? Then also looking at these three cities, moving back again inductively to say what principles should guide plan formulation and implementation. Now, when I studied the philosophers, I came up with these three general principles of equity, democracy, and diversity. And as I will talk about in a little bit, these are not, and this goes to the point that Andrew made earlier, that you don't always know what's right and what's wrong, because in fact these principles can conflict. That democracy doesn't always produce equity or diversity. And having diversity and democracy may indeed produce a public that's more involved and active, but on the other hand, may in fact result in greater inequality. Now, the philosophers I looked at in particular, I want everyone who talks about justice has to talk about John Rawls. Philosophy in the 20th century, Anglo-American philosophy, I should note, went a particular route, which was to get more and more involved in the study of language and to be more and more analytic, basically to say we can't talk about justice or we can't talk about goodness because how can you substantiate, how can you validate premises about that? So what we can talk about instead is what we can actually test using quantitative or simply logical methods. But it meant that most of what's important to us simply was off the table. So Rawls's famous theory of justice, instead of doing what earlier philosophers had done when talking about democracy or justice, of essentially deducing it from natural law, or if you're religious, from theology, from God, said, okay, if you, and he didn't put in these terms, I'm kind of translating it, but if you were a modern economist and you believed in public choice theory, that is, you believed in rational human beings and what rational person would do in a particular situation, well, what would rational people do if they were in what he called the original position? That is, if they did not know where they would end up in society, and he used the term veil of ignorance. If people were behind a veil of ignorance, what sort of society would they choose to have? Well, since the odds were that if you had a hierarchical society, you would more likely end up as a peon than as a sheik. I think I'm mixing up cultures, but at any rate, you're more likely to be at the bottom than the top if you're in a pyramidal hierarchy, that it would be rational for people to decide that they wanted a society that was more or less equal. He termed this somewhat confusingly the difference principle. But the difference principle essentially argued for equality, and its emphasis was on material equality, that is, equality of goods. Now, Rawls's probably more books have been written in philosophy pro or counter Rawls than any other subject matter in recent times. But he has been criticized, and somewhat, I think, correctly, for being overly concerned with material equality and not being sufficiently concerned with questions of identity, of difference, not in the sense of rich and poor, but in the sense of ethnicity, of gender, of caste, of all the ways in which people are disrespected, are not given recognition, even though they may, in fact, at times have material equality. So a number of philosophers have attempted to elaborate on a theory of justice which included other variables besides money, besides wealth. The one that perhaps most influenced my book is Martha Nussbaum, a philosopher at the University of Chicago who manages to turn out a large book a year, who's incredibly prolific, has worked with Amartya Sen, and has gone further than Sen. Sen developed something called the capabilities approach, which said that what equality meant was that people should have equal capabilities. That is, that people should have the equal opportunity to make the most of themselves in a number of ways, but he didn't specify the ways in which they would have these capabilities. Nussbaum actually makes us a kind of laundry list of capabilities like health, education, personal freedom, and in particular emphasizes what other philosophers like Axel Honneth have called recognition. Within philosophy, the term recognition refers to being treated with respect. And what's been, I think, the most important current in social thought in the last several decades has to do, in fact, with this issue of diversity and multiculturalism and recognition. You read Rawls and you can sort of adopt the notion that, well, all people are more or less alike. What Nussbaum and Iris Young emphasize is that people belong to groups, they have group affiliations, people are characterized by difference, and that difference should be respected rather than simply wiped out. So that adding to the concept of equity then comes the concept of diversity, of respect for diversity. Now, Nancy Fraser, in a debate she had with Axel Honneth, argued that one has to not forget about the economy. And the problem I have, and many others, David Harvey, for example, have with the emphasis in social thought on diversity and multiculturalism is it tends to forget about economic inequality. That it's as if economic inequality, which the Marxists make a mistake of sort of seeing all difference as based in economic inequality and race and nationalism and all those kinds of things would disappear if we had the triumph of the proletariat. And so in certain ways, the people who argue for respecting diversity are countering this Marxist obliviousness to difference. But in their doing so, they tend to go overboard and emphasize difference and forget about economic differences, which remain, of course, key in capitalist society. Then through all these philosophers is an emphasis on democracy, on self-determination of people. And democracy, when we're talking about it within the context of the city, is both extremely important, but also extremely problematic, and I will get to that too. Now I want to talk about three projects, one in each of my cities. First, New York. This is, of course, familiar to all of you. The new Yankee Stadium, made to look a lot like the old Yankee Stadium. The difference between the new Yankee Stadium and the old one, or among the several differences, but one is that it has skyboxes, and ball teams like skyboxes because they get very large proceeds from it. So what we have in Yankee Stadium is the richest team in baseball, which made threats through the years that it was going to maybe go to somewhere else, like perhaps New Jersey, needing to get a very large subsidy from the city and the state in order to stay in New York. Now, we know that for quite some time they wanted to move to the west side of Manhattan. The people on the west side, being quite politically powerful, managed to block that. And maybe if New York had gotten the Olympics, they wouldn't have succeeded, but since it didn't, they did. So it was good to stay in the Bronx. But in order to get it a new stadium and stay in the Bronx, although the team would claim that they're paying for the stadium, the team is actually paying a payment in lieu of taxes, a pilot, which pays for the stadium bond, that is, it pays for the interest on the bonds that were issued for the stadium. They are low-interest bonds because they use the public bonding authority. So the first big subsidy has to do with the availability of industrial revenue bonds, which no longer can legally be used for sports facilities. The second big subsidy has to do with it doesn't pay any property taxes because the pilot goes simply to pay off the bonds that built the stadium. The third big subsidy is that the MTA had to build it a railroad station. And the fourth big subsidy had to do with the stadium. The new stadium is on what had been the the most used public park in the Bronx. Because by law the park had to be replaced, the city had to acquire land to build new parks. And the new parks are very expensive, in fact, much more so than anticipated. They also aren't built yet, even though the stadium is. The Bronx Community Board voted against this particular project in the form it took. The Bronx Borough president got rid of those members of the board who had voted against it. So this is a fairly clear case of no democracy, of no equity, and I don't know what you would say about it in relation to diversity, but the team itself might be fairly diverse. But of course, one of the aspects usually of large public subsidies for sports teams is that their personal income tax usually goes somewhere else because they don't even usually live in the city, but live in the suburbs. And I don't know, maybe all the New York Yankees live in the city. But at any rate, it's exemplary of a style of promoting growth that has gone on in New York for a very long time, certainly well before the Bloomberg administration. Bloomberg, in fact, came in by saying he wasn't going to give big subsidies to sports teams, but in fact has done so in a very big way, as a matter of fact. So all the teams got their stadiums or their arenas. Now, another case that I looked at was the London Olympics. It's another sports-oriented case, of course. The winning bid for the Olympics that London made was based very strongly on what's called the Olympic legacy. And they have a very large team of planners working on the legacy. So here we see the envisioned legacy, which is a park. Now, in order to create this park, what they did was, one of the things, which was probably a good thing, was that they buried the high-tension electric wires that ran over the swampy land here. But one does wonder, do you need to have the Olympics in order to bury electric wires? But the other thing they had to do was move 600 businesses that were located on the site. Most of them are what tend to be called marginal businesses. But in fact, marginal businesses are marginal to people on the outside looking at them, but they employ a lot of people. And often they employ people who are low-skilled or may not speak English. So when we're talking about, as we are in New York about Willets Point, for example, when we're talking about auto body repair shops or small factories or food processing or garbage transfer or whatever we're talking about, they don't look good and they don't make a place beautiful. They don't attract high-end businesses to the area, but they do, in fact, employ people. So at any rate, the British government had to pay something, I can't remember the amount anymore, but well over £1 billion just to move these businesses that were on the Olympic site, some of which, of course, went out of business, as always happens when you move businesses. There's a whole to-do going on, which is supposed to be decided this week, as to what to do with the £600 million stadium that they built there. There are two premier soccer teams competing for it, one of which has committed itself to preserve the running track, which makes it no good for watching soccer, and the other of which says, well, it's just going to tear down the stadium and build another stadium on the site. So here we're talking about the legacy, which is supposed to bring jobs to the deprived East End of London, but not that many jobs will be brought, and the expenditure of over £16 billion to create these games and create the white elephant of the stadium, the white elephant of the aquatic facility, etc., raises, again, a number of questions about justice. Now, with that said, there are plans to build a fair amount of low-income housing, although not nearly as much as initially envisioned. The original thought was a private developer would build the Olympic Village, and then it would become housing for low-income people, at least in substantial part. But the private developer pulled out at the time of the financial crisis, so the money is all coming from the government at the moment to build the facility or to build the Olympic Village. And the question then becomes, again, mightn't we not have built this many units, however many units of low-income housing, without building an aquatic facility, a velodrome, an Olympic stadium, etc.? The third example, Amsterdam's Zuidas, is a business district on the south periphery of the city of Amsterdam. Now, I've used Amsterdam, you might say, as a foil in much of my work, because Amsterdam is a city which has had a social democratic government throughout its recent history, which has decentralization to 16 district governments. It has a very high level of participation and democracy. It is a very dense city, and it is a very multi-ethnic city. People, when I talk about Holland, will tend to say, well, it's really a small country and it's homogeneous, and so how can we compare it to New York? But in fact, the Netherlands has about the same population as the New York region. Amsterdam itself has a very large percentage of non-native Dutch living there, Turks, Moroccans, Surinamese, and Indonesians. Some of them are first generation, more now are second generation, but it has very strong ethnicity, and it certainly has ethnic division, as we've become much more aware of lately, as there's been considerable friction in the rise of a right-wing party. Nevertheless, it continues, although it has retrenched, it continues to build social housing. And what I always find interesting about the Dutch is if they think they've made a mistake, they go out to remedy it in a very serious way. So this large business district right now is all office. It's anchored by two major banks. It's divided by a railroad track and a highway. So what they want to do, and this is similar to what New York's doing on the west side, is to cover over the railroad and the road and to build on top of it. But what they want to build on top of it is not more office, but in fact mixed income housing, a university, cultural facilities, and to move it away from being simply an office district to being a mixed-use residential, cultural, and office district. They are, of course, hoping, as everybody now hopes, that the private sector will pay for a lot of the costs of the infrastructure. But there's a very serious commitment to equitable development. Likewise, in the rebuilding of the Balmermeer, a very large public housing project on the periphery, similar to Hope 6, they're turning it into a mixed-income project, but they aren't displacing any of the original residents. And in fact, many of the original residents, and it's a predominantly African, and, well, not African, but black, Surinamese, and to some lesser extent Turkish and Moroccan district, that many of the people who were in the original public housing are moving into the new housing, which is much of it in a sort of condominium form. So looking then at these three cases, I then attempt to move back again and say, why have we seen what we've seen, and what does it tell you about what can be done? Now, the emphasis that we hear in much of the, especially planning literature, on democracy and citizen participation is in many respects a response to the days of urban renewal, to the lack of bureaucratic responsiveness that was characteristic of the urban renewal planners, and based in some degree on an argument that if you give communities more power, if you have public participation, it will lead to redistribution of resources. But what we've seen, in fact, is we've had a lot more participation in the last, say, 20 years, but at the same time that we've also seen a lot more inequality rather than equality ensuing upon it. The movements of the 1960s and early 70s demanding community power were, in fact, rather radical movements, but participation now tends to be routinized, and it largely isn't about demands for redistribution, but largely tends to be dominated by homeowners, tends to be protecting one's property, whatever it is, rather than pressing for redistributive change, rather than pressing for more equity. One of the areas that I studied, or programs that I studied some years ago in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the Neighborhood Revitalization Program, which Alex Schwartz also worked on, was a very successful program for participation, was successful in revitalizing a number of neighborhoods, but in fact it did not produce much in the way of redistribution. And I went into much more detail on various examples, but my conclusion was that citizen participation is desirable. It provides local knowledge that bureaucrats who don't consult with local communities often proceed in ignorance. That greater democracy in itself is a desirable goal, but democracy is problematic in relationship to equity. Moreover, it's very hard to organize it so that it takes into account citywide concerns, but it can frequently be parochial. It's a matter of my neighborhood versus your neighborhood, and in many cases it can lead to corruption. Now, planning has become increasingly concerned with diversity, both physical. Jane Jacobs argued for a diversity of uses. She saw, I gave this talk in Vancouver last week, and I made a remark about Jane Jacobs as overemphasizing physical form and local color. And it turns out that the gentleman in front of me in the audience was her son, who took great umbrage at what I said. But at any rate, if you read Death and Life of Great American Cities, she's talked, diversity is her theme, but it is a very great emphasis on physical diversity. And in fact, she became quite popular with right-wing economists who basically took her critique of planning and said, see, this shows that we get a good diverse city if we just let the market do its work. But at any rate, the concern with diversity in terms of planning and policy making has merged with the concern of philosophers for what they call recognition. But there's a question of how do you plan for diversity? What we've seen in so-called lifestyle centers, which we find now scattered in suburban areas of the United States, is a simulacrum of diversity, of what looks like cute stores when you, cute little locally owned stores, when you look closer, turn out to be the Gap and Barnes & Noble, that they're painted different colors, they do have apartments above the stores, but they aren't socially diverse. In fact, just through physical planning, you don't create diversity. You create diversity through a combination of physical planning and providing, excuse me, providing for low income in projects that you build. Moreover, there is no necessary relationship between diversity and equity. You can have people who look different living together, but that doesn't mean that their economic situation is the same. The question of diversity in planning and policy has come up most strongly in the various so-called moving to opportunity programs. And here what you've seen is that often it involves the involuntary removal of low-income people, a kind of repeat of urban renewal, and rationalized as in the name of their own good, that they'll be better off. Thus, the effort to obtain diversity and democracy may in fact cut against equity. And one of the things that's most difficult when attempting to apply principles of democracy, diversity, and equity is that they may be in contradiction to each other. And consequently, what is the most just policy at any moment is not wholly determinate. That is, we can't say in advance necessarily what it is that we want to do. Still, I did try to spell out criteria which would allow us to evaluate policy. And what I argued is that as among these three principles of democracy, diversity, and equity, that when they are in conflict with each other, equity should receive priority. So I came up with this list of kinds of policies, and given that I've about used up my time, I'm not going to read them, although you can look at them. But the argument is that we need to provide a lot more housing for low-income people, that we, of course, see frequently the blocking by not just public officials, but by neighborhoods that don't want poor people living in them, and that that really should not be tolerated. When I was in Vancouver, I was struck by, in fact, the commitment there to provide housing. And in Vancouver, I'm surprised to hear, has higher housing prices than does New York. So it's a very expensive city, but they build a lot more social housing than does New York. Moreover, housing, once it's in the low-income pool, does not, after 20 years, suddenly come out of that pool. And one of New York's huge problems at the moment is as much housing is being built, that much is also being withdrawn. The argument for diversity may mean that that if you're building new areas, you want to have them diverse in terms of ethnicity, color, and income, but that doesn't mean that you take old areas where people are living and say, well, we'll make them diverse by forcing poor people to move somewhere else. Then in terms of economic development programs, we have this huge tilt for subsidizing large business instead of small business. The extent to which we give subsidies to NBC or the Yankees means that we're not giving subsidies to small business owners who carry a relatively much higher tax burden than do large businesses in subsidized buildings. To the extent that we are rezoning and subsidizing large commercial developments, that there needs to be requirements that small businesses be in them. I was recently in Cleveland, where they're starting a lot of worker-owned co-ops. They're actually sending people to look at Mondragon, which has gone on now for generations of having cooperative industry. And the cooperative movement is one that can, in fact, be fostered. These large developments, the Atlantic Yards and West Side development kinds of projects, need to be very heavily scrutinized to make sure that they do provide not indirect benefits, not simply trickle down, but direct benefits to low-income people. Moreover, there should be value recapture. If the area is increasing in value, it doesn't mean that all the increase in value should go into a tax increment district, which does nothing but further subsidize the area that's being developed. But instead that there should be public participation in the profits. Amsterdam, the city, owns almost all the land that within its boundaries, and it raises the land rent as the value goes up. Low transit fares are very important for low-income people. Getting to work costs a lot for people, a large proportion of their income for low-income people. So low-income people need to have low fares, while well-to-do commuters should not. Then in planning, there's been a huge emphasis among those people who call themselves communicative theorists on participation and on what they like to call listening. When I was in Vancouver and lecturing to some planning students, I said, what do planners do? They said, listen. Well, you have to do more than listen. You have to, in fact, propose and plan. And this means intervening in order to support equitable outcomes. That participation, as I said earlier, does not necessarily promote more equitable outcomes. Then, just very briefly, I don't think that we necessarily want to break up ethnic enclaves or racial enclaves, but that public policy shouldn't be used to further discrimination, that public spaces should be open to everyone, that nobody should fear going into someone else's neighborhood, that boundaries between neighborhoods to use Iris Young's phrase, should be porous. And to the extent desired, uses and areas should be mixed in, or areas should be mixed in use and mixed in population, but that you shouldn't, I don't think you ought to make people live next door to people with very different lifestyles. All of us who have lived next to people who have 24-hour-a-day parties might know that it isn't always, let people have their parties, but don't make you live next to them. Then finally, yes, there should be consultation. However, the existing population of a small area shouldn't be the sole arbiter of its function, because citywide considerations also should apply. Then there's simply a problem of getting participation when you're talking about the development of large unoccupied spaces, because no one has a very direct interest in them, and therefore, for those of you who've sought to engender participation, you know how hard it is to get people to participate, but you should try. So in conclusion, there are obvious limits on what you can do. When I came in here this morning, Mark Willis said to me, well, you're not going to find a just city here right now. And of course, that's true. And we're seeing, if anything, a tendency in the other direction, which might explain why there's now so many conferences on the subject of social justice and so much concern, because we have seen such a deepening of inequality. But I would argue that if we talk about justice a lot, and in particular, if when we're talking about appropriate policy, we don't simply ask what's going to create growth, what's going to produce the biggest return, but in fact constantly ask, well, is this policy just? We are required to make environmental impact statements when we do large physical projects. Well, how about a justice statement as well? So that if justice is to be the outcome, we at least can start by talking about justice in every context where we make policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Fainstein. I'm going to introduce our panelists. If, at the far end of the table is Chung-Wha Hong. She is Executive Director of the New York Immigration Coalition, which is a statewide policy and advocacy umbrella organization with about 200 member organizations. Next to her is Brad Lander, who's a councilman from a number of neighborhoods in Brooklyn, most notably my old neighborhood, Park Slope, and also the waterfront, Windsor Terrace, Borough Park, Kensington, et cetera, and former director of Pratt Institute for Community Development and the Fifth Avenue Committee. And Ken Knuckles is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Upper Manhattan Empowerment Zone and Vice Chair of the City Planning Commission for most of the Bloomberg era, and has been in city politics for much longer than that. I wanted to start with a little bit of a discussion about sort of policy and planning for what purpose. We talked a little bit about how there's a feeling that we're moving further away from equity in New York. I guess one of the key questions is about the growth imperative. There are many political theorists have argued that you absolutely, as a mayor, you have to have a growth imperative. You cannot fill the coffers of city government and provide services and maintain your governing coalition unless the economy grows. Can mayors have anything other than that at the top of their agenda? Brad, you want to start?
Well, let me first say thank you to Susan for the book and the presentation, which I found personally extremely helpful and rewarding. First, just at this very personal level, where I've always felt like the part of me that longs to be back in graduate school reading political philosophy, and the part of me that's trying to figure out how to get a tiny little bit of something on this week's legislative agenda are miles and miles apart, and nothing could possibly connect them. So I'm glad to at least have some something that connects them. And I'll maybe talk a little bit about this later, but the agenda laid out here is very much what I've been working on at the Fifth Avenue Committee and the Pratt Center and in the City Council. And many of you in the room actually were involved in developing this One City, One Future agenda, which I feel like is more or less taken directly from the Just City. So I'm very appreciative. But I think there are a couple of questions about sort of getting there from here. This is an outstanding, I think, kind of case for why equity planning is central and good, but it almost feels a little bit like maybe it's an alternative universe, and how do we get there from here? So I hope we have a minute to come back and talk about the politics. But on the question of the growth imperative, I mean, I think it is a powerful one, and I left kind of wanting a little more on two fronts from the book. I do think that progressives or mayors or anybody, need something, some theory for kind of economic drivers. How are we going to generate prosperity in addition to how we're going to do better at sharing it? I think there's a lot to say there. I mean, last week I spent about half a day in the Brooklyn Navy Yard with Andrew Kimball. And, I think we sometimes fall back on, what is more diverse, what's a manufacturing sector, what is 21st century manufacturing, and in a funny way, I think the kind of eagerness of progressives to talk about the green economy and green manufacturing, because we don't know what that means or exactly what to say, but we have to talk somehow about generating prosperity as well as sharing it, and we're not great at that. I do think, actually, if you go spend a half day in the Navy Yard, you come out convinced that if we did move some meaningful chunk of our subsidies from large-scale real estate developments into thoughtful approaches to those pieces of the productive economy that make sense in New York City. We really have to think about why it makes sense here locationally. Can it compete on wages and on real estate price? But at least if we're going to give out subsidy, let's do it in those sectors that there's a compelling argument for why they can be here and that they are more distributively equal than dumping more money after real estate and financial services, which I think have driven our city to higher and higher and higher levels of inequality. Just one stat on this point, then a great Fiscal Policy Institute study that came out. The top 1% of households in New York City took home 20% of the city's total income in 1990 and 44% of the city's total income in 2007. So inequality is being massively driven by the way we generate income. And while I definitely want to get to where is affordable housing and how we kind of think about what's happening in neighborhoods, we got to do something about that. So one, yes to growth, but let's also invest in those economic sectors that do better jobs of distributing more equally and organize more of our subsidies that way. And then second on growth, and then I'll shut up. I would love a little more. I'd love to hear from Susan on how to think about the trade-offs. She talks a little bit about sort of utilitarianism in the book. But let's say for a minute that we could generate a little less wealth in New York, but share it much more equally. Well, I would take it. But if we were going to generate a lot less wealth and share it much more equally, there's some point past which presumably that wouldn't be smart. And thinking about those trade-offs is another thing I don't think we always do well. And then we're beat badly politically because we look like we haven't thought about it. And so if we propose cutting the 421A real estate subsidy, which I'll talk a little more about later, which I think is just we're made to look like muddle-headed folk who would run the city into the ground if we were given the reins in the name of equality. And so I think we also have to at least be thoughtful about when we're talking about that trade-off. And I totally agree, justice and equity need to be put as first principles. The growth is in order to deliver a better distribution of quality of life. But still, being thoughtful about that trade-off is essential.
Right. Ken, keeping in mind this question of that sort of trade-off between growth and justice, or is there a trade-off? In the deliberations of the City Planning Commission, is justice, as Susan has defined it, a consideration?
It is. I think justice is generally defined by outcomes. And people tend to see justice or a just outcome as being justice. If it's not an outcome you like, then it's not just. But yes, I think justice and what each of us, the 13 of us who constitute the City Planning Commission, how we define it, given our own perspectives and experiences, it does factor in to our decision-making. And I think, moreover, that New York, for all of its imperfections, relative to other cities, is, I think, relatively progressive in the way we look at planning. Certainly, in the case of housing, it is certainly a very, very high priority of the City Planning Commission to deploy inclusionary housing when and where we can. We're always looking at the impact of density on neighborhoods, what it's going to do. And in fact, the more than 100 rezonings that the City Planning Commission has done during the course of the Bloomberg administration, most of those rezonings really have been propelled by neighborhoods that wanted to maintain their character. I think downzonings really started in Staten Island. And while the rezonings that we have done have repositioned, in many cases, some of the transit centers, like Queens and the hub in the Bronx and 125th Street, in an effort to generate more business and make economic development more vital in these areas. There's a simultaneous effort to make sure that neighborhoods that are distinct in their character, that are somewhat removed from transportation, are not overwhelmed by out-of-scale housing developments. So I think that the Planning Commission, by and large, has been quite sensitive. Certainly not to the satisfaction of everyone, perhaps in given instances not even to the satisfaction of each of us. But I do think that justice is a part of the consideration.
Brad?
I guess I want to ask about whether you really think that downzonings are rooted in a justice principle.
Well, they're rooted in a justice principle in terms of, as I said, outcomes. People don't want to see neighborhoods that they've lived in change in character. Now,
They're certainly rooted in a preservation principle.
They're rooted in a preservation principle, but you know, I live in a neighborhood, you live in a neighborhood. I think to the extent that we value where we live, we look at characteristics of those neighborhoods and the virtues of those neighborhoods, and we want to maintain them.
I think it evokes this question of local democracy versus citywide issues coming into the discussion. You know, locally, people want to preserve what they've got, but does that encompass?
And I fought my share of preservation fights. I don't want them building a 12-story building on my block either.
Right.
But I think if we take justice seriously, then we have to ask, if that's been the biggest thing we've done, if that's driven, you know, a lot of our neighborhood planning, how are we seeking to, I mean, and if we believe justice should be kind of a core principle, where are we doing that? How are we achieving that? Is that as high a goal as it needs to be relative to preserving neighborhood character?
Well, I think, again, it's been a driving force. I don't think it's been the singular force. I think there's been a pretty good balance of bringing growth where there should be growth, and preserving neighborhoods where I think, in the absence of these kinds of preservation and downzoning tendencies, neighborhoods would lose their character. And I think it's a balance at the end of the day, like most things are in New York City. But from my vantage point, I think we have been largely successful in striking a balance.
So I think there's a tension that Susan talked about in political philosophy around this question of the utilitarians say that this is whatever benefits the majority, whatever makes the majority of the people happy is the best policy decision. Whereas Rawls would say it's the least, whatever makes the least well off better off is the most just decision. And it can be very hard to choose. And I think one of the examples you use in the book, you talk about urban redevelopment that displaces people. You know, in what situation, I mean, it may work to the benefit of the city to have a new sports stadium or, you know, something even more specific like, you know, the West Side rezonings of the 80s that transformed the central business districts. It certainly displaced a heck of a lot of people. You might even say it caused the homelessness problem that we ended up with in much of the 1980s. Didn't make the least well-off better, but maybe it worked to the long-term benefit of the city. Are these just sort of abstract theories that we're struggling with, or are these real sort of weighty things we have to decide? You know, what is to the long-term benefit of the city?
I would argue that you can have growth with much greater equity than New York has had, and we can, and that's why I like Amsterdam, because Amsterdam is a city which has, in fact, done economically extremely well, and right now has an unemployment rate about half of what New York has. It has a very active and very large economic development policy unit, which emphasizes not building buildings, but emphasizes training programs, job placement, attracting business by offering them not so much premises as a workforce that's well-trained. One has to mistrust these kinds of anecdotes, but I'll do it anyways. Which I was sitting next to on a plane, a guy who was a management consultant, and he mentioned that his firm had just opened an office in Europe. So I'm always interested, of course, in industrial locations. So I asked where. He said, well, in Holland. And I said, why? He said he could have been anywhere in the EU. He had to have an office within the boundaries of the EU. But he picked Holland because they had gone out and solicited him, because they had promised to train his staff, have nothing to do with building very large office buildings, based on the argument that if we don't build this office building, some firm is going to move to New Jersey, which has been, I mean, New York has subsidized virtually indiscriminately firms that were never, ever going to go somewhere else. NBC wasn't going to go somewhere else. The Yankees weren't going to go somewhere else. The New York Stock Exchange wasn't going anywhere else. These are firms that have to be here, but they get money.
So Chung-Wha, one of the great things about New York is it's quite possibly the most ethnically diverse city in the world at this point. At the same time, when you think about this question of equity, as Brad was saying, you know, the top whatever percent has 44% of the income. The reality is in that bottom fifth of the socioeconomic ladder, immigrants are way overrepresented. And equity, so for diversity, we've got a situation of inequity that is extraordinary. How does policy address that, and how do we sort of balance these questions of growth and equity from a perspective of immigrant rights and the workforce?
It's a small question.
Yeah.
First of all, we think that the idea of growth is something that we can co-opt. We say where there's immigration, there's growth. Where there's growth, there's immigration. But trying to change the concept of growth into a shared prosperity concept. And that we believe that growth is not mutually exclusive with shared prosperity, and it's not antithetical to raising the floor. And so that's what we try to do. Unfortunately, a lot of immigrants aren't even on the ladder. They're like, you know, that the problem, like the point of departure for these discussions is just so different, because when you have a country where 12 million people are completely outside of a legal regime where you have no identity and you have no papers, and you know, you could get deported any second. And, you know, literally every year we have a deportation industrial complex that deports 400,000 people a year. We're looking at a situation where people are just like off the map. And so I think one of our strategies in how do we make sure that immigrants actually participate in helping to generate shared prosperity is that this belief that we will have growth when there's maximum participation by everybody. And that let's look at, in our major systems, let's look at where the inequities are, where the disparities are. And so you take something like simple like healthcare, non-citizens are 3 times as likely to be uninsured, 3 times. Now that's a pretty big disparity. And it just didn't come out of nowhere. It's because of a set of rules that we have decided on, including the latest one in the healthcare reform bill, despite many good parts. It excluded, for example, it prohibits undocumented immigrants from buying full-priced private insurance with their own money in the exchange. So that's the level of exclusion that people will go towards to exclude immigrants. And so it puts an additional burden on localities to help make up for the flaws of federal policies. So it gives New York more opportunities to kind of lead in helping to remove those barriers. And so New York has done a good job on the state level, continuing to provide equal benefits when there are differential and exclusion in some cases. But I think, we are looking at what are the policy and regulatory mechanisms that just exclude people even from the universe that we're talking about. Because if you look at something like a job training system, immigrants are just simply not eligible. So you could have a great, beautiful strategy toward career path, but you can't get on the path. So I think we're looking at a fundamental kind of reforms of major systems that are supposed to address these barriers, such as healthcare system, the education system, the workforce development system, the housing system. And so our work is very horizontal in trying to close those gaps. And I could tell you similar statistics in addition to healthcare and education, housing, worker rights, that shows us, tremendous gap. But I think we need to get on the ladder first and then look at what are the mobility, barriers.
So on the one hand, you're talking about just more resources for these kind of programs and services, but on the other hand, it's also a very much a value-based moral decision about whether to make these programs accessible to undocumented or even in some cases documented immigrants, right? I mean, how?
That's right. You could be legal and pay taxes that pay for Medicaid, but if you get hit by a bus, you need Medicaid, you can't get it in many parts of the country for the first 5 years. You're a legal immigrant. Right. So it just kind of tears the basic compact of what you pay into the society and what you get out of it. And so it really, I think, forces the moral question, to the equity. It's not just a distribution issue, but we don't even have the distribution channels that
Right.
would,
And yet, is there an argument to be made that immigration is in many ways the sort of driving engine or a driving engine for New York City?
Yeah, and this is kind of the trap here, because immigration, I think, is a neutral force that could be used either to help drive shared prosperity, economic growth, or it could be used to drive race to the bottom if we continue to let exploitation and kind of lower standards justify that, based on the legality of the workers, as opposed to looking at the entire labor standards, for instance. So, I don't say immigration is good under all circumstances. More immigration, the better. I think we need to look at how that impacts those standards that we've set up and have tried hard to protect, and make sure that the rights and the immigration happen at the same time.
Right. Brad?
Well, just one thing I think is interesting on this front. If you think about sort of the boom of the decade previous to the current one, the sort of media narrative is primarily about the gentrification pieces of it, right? Sort of boom on Wall Street, boom in high-priced housing, large-scale development projects, many of them over-subsidized. And that's an important, I'm not sort of, and what to do about that. How does that relate to growth and how much we want, what neighborhoods it's going to happen in, and what should be the rules of such development and how its benefits should be shared. So I don't think we got that right mostly, but we had a lot of conversation about it. But the truth is, it's a pretty modest share of the growth in New York City, I think, is more attributable to gentrification. A much bigger share of just a certainly population increase in that decade was attributable to immigration. And we didn't have anywhere near the conversation about what does sort of justice or equity in a growing city that's growing as a result of substantial immigration mean, and so what does that mean in, Woodside, well, in the neighborhoods where immigration is really transforming those neighborhoods, as opposed to gentrification, and how to think about that in our planning. And this to me goes to goes back to the question, the conversation that Ken and I were having. I think we had a narrative about what to do in those areas we thought were right for growth. Again, I don't think we did anywhere near enough to make justice the core principle. I think, I don't know if our inclusionary zoning were mandatory and not voluntary, if our affordable housing were permanent. There's a lot of ways it could be better, but we had some dialogue about growth and how its benefits would be shared. We had a lot of dialogue about protecting neighborhoods that didn't want any growth, and we really didn't have a planning dialogue about substantially growing immigrant neighborhoods and what kinds of investments would make them stronger, better, more inclusive places to live.
Yeah, if I could add to that, there's no question that immigration saved New York, that there continues to be a net out-migration of white middle-class New Yorkers, and their replacement really by immigrants, many of whom have become, of course, middle class, and that a lot of these neighborhoods that were abandoned are now thriving as a consequence of immigrant industry. And I might add, it's not just retail shops selling ethnic baked goods, but a lot of it is production, a small-scale production of various kinds. And people in those neighborhoods, even though New York does have local economic development corporations, and it has planners who work with them, and it has various bids out in the neighborhoods and so forth, but even so, people in those neighborhoods will complain bitterly about the lack of assistance they get in terms of access to loans, in terms of not being able to park their trucks in order to service their businesses, of not getting sufficient attention to various of their sanitation problems, of generally being, well, one of the studies I did was of the tourism industry in New York and the extent to which it got to neighborhoods, including Harlem, which has had a fair amount of tourism, but other ethnic neighborhoods as well. There isn't good signing. The guidebooks often ignore neighborhoods that aren't in Manhattan. That I interviewed in various of the boroughs where they were trying to bring in tourism dollars, and they felt that they got very little cooperation from the central administration. So that there really are ways that you can foster economic development that are more small scale, but which aggregate to something more.
I want to come back to Harlem and even Yankee Stadium and the sort of land use discussions and development and its impact. But before we leave this question of diversity, there's this other issue around diversity about the question of the city is for everybody. The city, equal access to everything, no matter what your culture, no matter what your social economic status, and so on. This past week in England, the Prime Minister, David Cameron, came out criticizing multiculturalism as a policy, which has stood for decades in much of Europe as a policy whereby cultures could maintain their independent status and their independent cultural values within the larger construct of English society, in this case, UK society. And to what degree is that relevant in New York? To what degree do we sort of support difference and support the ability of people to live as they like in New York as compared to European cities?
Well, I think tribalism is kind of the essence of New York, in a real sense. New York is this polyglot of cultures. I think the test and the stress over time has been how they rub up against one another, interact with one another, react to one another. But I think the notion of a homogeneity in New York is almost ludicrous. And I think the real strength of New York is that. But this notion of equity and fairness has to be seen within the context of that diversity, because not everyone has shared in the spoils. I think, efforts are being made both large and small. I've been in and around government a long time, and while we want government to be more responsive and more expansive, the sad truth is that the resources aren't there. So I think more wherewithal has got to be given to local efforts, and that's something that government should do. The empowerment zone that I've headed for the last 8 years is one such effort. It took public money, city, state, and federal money, and the purpose of it was to leverage private investment. I think by and large that has happened in Upper Manhattan. There is a bit more in the way of choice now, retail and commercial choices. We've seen a real estate boom up there, which is now cooling off, and that's probably a good thing, because a lot of the sense of siege among indigenous residents, I think, has diminished somewhat, at least for the moment. But I think this notion that everyone must have a seat at the table is something that government has to recognize, and to the degree that it can, continue to foster.
Yeah. Well, as being head of the Upper Manhattan Empowerment Zone, you've been right there in the thick of the debate about the changes that have taken place in Harlem.
Right.
How do you balance that? I mean, there's a lot of criticism from people who feel like they're being displaced. There's other people who are, look at just the physical reality of the housing stock and business in Harlem, and it's far better than it was a decade ago.
Well, I think, to really gauge it accurately, you've got to look at the arc of change over Harlem in the last 25 years. In the late 1980s, about 65% of Harlem was owned by the city, the real estate. It was in RIM. Right. To a lesser degree, but substantially, was also the case in the South Bronx, where I was deputy borough president in the late 80s. So into that abyss was an opportunity. There was lots of vacant land in Harlem, lots of thousands and thousands of units that were empty and vacant and abandoned. What you've seen, certainly in Harlem over the last 15 years, is development, but I can't think of, and Mark Willis is here, he could probably dispute me if I'm wrong, but I can't think of an instance where 20 years ago poor people lived, right, actively, and now there is, luxury housing. I can show you where there were empty parcels, and now there's affordable units, and some degree there may be some moderate income. But in terms of direct displacement of poor people, I don't believe that's happened in Harlem. What you have seen is that vacant land is used as a subsidy for developers to come in and build, and in many cases, in most cases, there is economic diversity. So I think in the case of Harlem, certainly, there is a kind of culture shock when you haven't seen white people at all in your neighborhood except police officers. Right. And then suddenly, you see at 9 o'clock in the morning a white woman with a baby carriage walking down the street, and you've never seen that before. So. And for many people, that was and is a culture shock. But I think in terms of outright displacement, you haven't seen that in Harlem. You have seen an infiltration. You have seen a diversification of the of the population, because many, many, many black people left Harlem between 1950 and 1980. And that void, to some degree, has been filled by not only white folks, but to a far greater degree, Latinos, such that maybe 55% now of Harlem is supposedly African American. But I think if you talk to people who were there, and you compare it, 2010 to 1970, I think most people will tell you it's a better place.
Brad, do you agree with that?
I hesitate a little. I co-chair the Progressive Caucus of the New York City Council with Melissa Markey-Viverito, who's East Harlem councilwoman, and who I think would say there's been plenty of good things that have happened, but a good share of displacement, whether direct or indirect. I think it's true that there are fewer places where the city said, we're going to build luxury housing on this site, we're going to throw low-income families out. But because the rent laws have been substantially weakened and we're losing rent-regulated housing right and left, especially in Manhattan, and a lot of those units have been uptown, and so units that used to be rent-regulated units in which African Americans lived in Harlem have been lost, not through, again, kind of the direct investment of the cities, but because we haven't been sufficiently thoughtful to what equity means when we act. So if we had strengthened the rent laws, and I guess probably the biggest at-risk Harlem property, I assume, are the Donné Day portfolio. That's a portfolio of privately owned rental units in which a set of predatory investors, believing sort of correctly we wouldn't really enforce the rent laws, bought up that property at much more than its value, worked to jack up the rents, drove some tenants out, and then as the markets have crashed, are unable to maintain their properties, and we're not quite sure what we're going to do about it. So, and then, I think, look, Melissa's been fantastic. A lot of this has been site by site, so that I do think on the East River Plaza and the East 125th Street projects that sort of were in her domain, she was able to say, we're going to make sure that the jobs hire, that the businesses hire locally, that jobs do better, pay a living wage. I wish those didn't have to be site-by-site fights, and we simply had some policies. Every time we're dumping subsidy in, the jobs are going to pay the living or prevailing wage. We're going to have a local hiring rule. But I do think some of those projects, as a result of good local organizing, have done better at distributing their benefits more equally. But I wouldn't be quite so sanguine about displacement. We may have another minute to talk about I think the next couple of months will be interesting because, to me, the rent laws in New York City are sort of the essence of kind of how New York City approaches the questions that Susan raises in the book.
Around diversity, especially in a way, socioeconomic diversity.
I would say around equity as well. I think the opportunities for low-income working class people to live in New York City, yes, in a diverse range of neighborhoods, but also just with stability and in general, are very substantially rooted in the rent laws. Let's be honest, they cost us a little money. I don't doubt that if we didn't have them, real estate taxes would be a little higher and the city could collect more revenue. So if you were looking exclusively at the growth question, I suppose you would say, do away with them, let's collect more revenue and then pump that revenue into subsidy. But I think that would be, it would lead to massive displacement. It would lead to a very much less diverse city. But I'm nervous, we got a few months of this fight and it's not set up well. Meanwhile, the real estate lobby is fighting to preserve this 421A property tax rule that I mentioned before, and they seem much better set up to get what they want in terms of kind of, even more essentially out of Albany in terms of what that brings. And I'm very anxious, and I guess we can spend a minute on this at the end, about how you build the politics, build a coalition, build something like maybe just the lowercase m movement behind the ideas in this book. Because otherwise, the rent laws will continue to get weakened, we'll continue to see displacement, we'll continue to put our subsidies into mostly real estate projects when, then have local fights around how to share a few of the goodies.
Yeah, I do want to save that for the very end.
I want to note that Los Angeles does have an effective coalition that has managed to get a citywide living wage act, which means that it isn't site by site, but that any city subsidized program is real estate development is required to provide a living wage to its employees, not just the construction workers, but the people working there thereafter. and either it has to include health insurance, or if it doesn't, it has to be a higher wage. So that in that respect, New York is really less progressive than what's the second largest city in the United States. And you can't say, well, LA is in some way really different, because it is as diverse and it is almost as big. But
And
it
not
depend-
exactly a social democracy.
No, but it did depend on having an alliance between labor and community groups of a sort that New York, for whatever reason, has never managed to develop, even though New York is supposedly the most unionized city in America.
It's declining.
That
So-
might be the reason they're just too strong.
Say that again?
I think that might be part of the reason they're very strong, and and whether it's in the sectors that they're active in. But I think it's looking positive. I feel like all the having had directly work with unions and sometimes with businesses on the other side, I think on education and healthcare and stuff, there's a lot more awareness by the unions around community. Community needs, particularly immigrant communities. So I think we're getting there. But
Right. So in a minute, I'm going to take questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and somebody will come around with a microphone. You talked about resources. There's just not enough resources for so much of what we want to do, and really, ultimately, that's what much of this debate comes down to. And right now, one of the big discussions is this problem with state and local budget deficits. Back in the first couple of years of the Bloomberg administration, that was resolved with some pretty large tax hikes. But tax hikes are now, by all accounts, off the table, not even to be considered. How is justice defined in that debate? Why is it that tax hikes, even for the wealthy, for the highest incomes, are not even on the table anymore compared to 7 years ago?
Well, that goes to the triumph of neoliberalism and the argument that if you tax, somehow you will destroy growth, and that the more money that's placed into private hands, the more prosperity we'll have. If you compare the United States to Europe, of course, Europe taxes much higher. People simply expect to pay more, especially in Northern Europe, in tax, and they expect to get more services from the public sector. We put ourselves in a situation where, since we have to buy everything in the private market, we need to have more private money in order to buy it. And of course, if you're an upper middle class New Yorker, you send your kid to private school, you belong to a private gym. New York now has, in one of its less equitable moves, now has a fee for the use of recreation centers, which used to be free. That there's a constant move towards pricing everything, of having user fees, of cost recapture, and they have all these nice words for doing it, but that essentially we move further and further away from having a large, non-marketized public sector. And the argument that's always made on the right is that, well, everything should be means tested, and why should we give free anything to people who can pay for it? But of course, the more you target benefits to people who are low income, the less political support that it has. And that's a very deliberate move. The argument is always, that we, Republicans care so much about employment. Whenever you're talking about taxation, if we have taxes, we'll just create more unemployment. That only the care about unemployment only comes up in those kinds of situations. Now, why Governor Cuomo wishes to get rid of the surtax on the very wealthy is not at all clear to me. And he is, after all, supposedly a Democrat. Why this is his first thing on the agenda, I am completely don't understand.
I'll note that Bloomberg was, at least in name, a Republican when he jacked up the taxes on earners over $250,000 a year, and an 18% property tax hike back in 2002, 2003.
Well, it's like Nixon going to China. Yeah. Only the Republicans can get away with it, seeming like.
Anybody else want to comment on that one?
Well, I would say in Mike Bloomberg's case, he raised those taxes in order to preserve, what was left of the city's safety net. And I think politically it was probably a masterstroke for him, certainly at that time. But I do think the times that we're living in now are a bit different. And I don't know, how do you close a $9 billion gap? You know, I mean, there's only two ways you can do it. You know, you can, or a combination of, you know, raising taxes and reducing government. So as much as we don't like to see services diminished, I think the sad reality is that there's going to have to be, and I don't come down on the side of no tax cuts at all, but I do think that the politics of the day, which people are responding to, local officials are responding to, and even the president to some degree is responding to, is the reality that tax increases are just not going to be politically feasible. So those of us who believe that a different outcome should be will have to be more politically active.
Brad? Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's no doubt that the politics are not where we want them to be, or where I want them to be on this. I do think there are leadership questions here, though. We did, the Progressive Caucus in December, made a proposal. We observed that the vast majority of New Yorkers, according to polling, agreed with President Obama's original position on the Bush-era tax cuts, that the tax cuts should not be extended for the top 2% of households. Well, even they would actually get them up to $250,000 of income, just not on income above that. And that was the overwhelming consensus position of most Americans, actually, and the vast majority of New Yorkers. So when it failed in Congress because, of the prevailing political winds of the day and the elevation of John Boehner to Speaker of the House, we said, well, all right, if New Yorkers agree with that, let's just do it here. How much would it be if the Bush-era tax cuts on New Yorkers, those, and don't forget here that, this ties to the stat I said before, about 1% of households in New York going from 20% of the income to 44% of the income. Those are the same people, right, that would have been asked to pay the Bush-era tax cuts. If we collected it here, what would we get? And the answer is $8 billion. $8 billion is what the New York share of the Bush-era tax cuts would be. And we could deal substantially with the withdrawal of federal stimulus money. We would still have to make some cuts. And let me be clear, we've made a lot of cuts. We basically are no longer giving child care to low-income working families. We've raised class size. We've reduced the police force. We've made a lot of cuts. So it's not, and we'll keep doing it, but boy, that would be a more balanced approach. And so to have instead the governor, rather than say, all right, well, let's talk about it over $1 million, or, let's talk just about that top 1% and not 2%, instead say, you know what, not only are we not going to do any new taxes, we're going to give the wealthiest New Yorkers a tax cut. We're going to let this existing surcharge that we have, the existing slightly more progressive structure, under which still they've doubled their share of income, a tax cut is, in my opinion, irresponsible leadership. And yes, we need to build the politics from the ground up, but I do think we should expect our elected officials, when we're going to talk about shared sacrifice and we're going to talk about balance, to mean it. I'm not.
Brad, how do you explain his doing this? I mean, no, you didn't hear a great public hue and cry to get rid of taxes on
I thought I went pretty far in my last statement. I don't see why I should have to go further than that. I think speculating on motives. Obviously, I do think that Ken is right. He's responding to a perceived political moment in which somehow austerity is like a political platform. I guess, look, these are anxious times, a lot of different directions, and a lot of that anxiety is directed at government. This is where I do think, actually, I would ask a few more questions about what participation looks like, because clearly a lot of people, for a deep range of reasons that, I don't have time to talk about right now, look on government with skepticism, have come to believe that it's the problem, that somehow it's public sector workers that are the ones who have, and I would really, here's what I would urge people to do. Go to the website falseeconomy.org.uk, or maybe .uk.org. There's this wonderful little 2-minute video that a British coalition of folks kind of opposed to, the approach that Cameron is taking of sort of only cuts, have put this wonderful video up, and it begins with a little 8-year-old English girl saying, the cuts mean there'll be no new playgrounds for me and my friends. That'll teach me not to gamble on credit default swaps.
There you go.
You know, the rest of the video is good as well. So, you know, nonetheless, the anxiety that people have about the moment that we're in has fed an anti-government sentiment and has led to sort of the idea of austerity as a political platform, and a lot of people are riding that wave. I think it will do us harm in the long run. That's not to say we don't have to pay attention to living within our means as government. Of course we do. But that's got to be a balanced conversation.
Did anyone
that
happen to
considers
notice that Henry Paulson made $5 billion in one day last week for betting on gold?
John
think that's
Paulson,
John
let's be fair.
Paulson.
Yes,
John
yes, we
John
should
Paulson.
be to
I'm
the
sorry,
Paulsons.
different Paulson.
Not
But
the
I mean,
Treasury
we
Secretary.
have to make progress even locally, don't we? I mean,
Yes,
how many
yes,
people
yes,
are in the
yes.
Progressive Caucus?
12.
Okay. So you got 39 people to,
We got a
So
long way to
win
go.
over.
There's no doubt.
I want to make sure we get a few questions from the audience here, and then talk a little bit about the politics. Yep.
Hi. I wanted to
And
think
please
about-
identify yourself.
I'm Margaret Bork. I teach government at Manhattan College. I'm involved in community stuff in the Bronx. And I'm wondering how we can win the justice argument in the battle for the living wage in New York City, which is going on right now. Its proponents argue, as Dr. Fainstein does, that large subsidized projects should include a living wage requirement. But its opponents say minimum wage jobs are better than no jobs and that people will apply for them, and therefore how can we deny people the chance to work for $7 a day?
Well, in all the places which have, in fact, raised the minimum wage, the economists who've looked at it haven't found that it's had any impact on unemployment. And there have been studies that looked at McDonald's in one state as opposed to another where the minimum wage is different, and they haven't found that McDonald's employed fewer people. Nobody seems to have noticed that LA has suffered as a consequence of its minimum wage law. What minimum wage laws in fact do is level the playing field so that you don't have a constant race to the bottom. The assumption that somehow if you pay people more in service occupations, that they simply won't employ people, it's based, I don't know. It seems to be based on a lot of false arguments. And what we don't have, of course, in most service occupations is the kind of unions we had in manufacturing. And it wasn't something intrinsic to manufacturing that made manufacturing jobs high-wage jobs. It was how manufacturing workers were organized. Well, since it's very hard to unionize people in relatively small workplaces, it can only be through legislation. But if you have a floor that's uniform, then you're not going to have such job loss. And in fact, of course, unlike manufacturing, service occupations can't pick up and move. The Marriott Hotel in New York isn't going to move to Venezuela or something, or Taiwan, because it's cheaper there. There's a Marriott Hotel there too, probably. But that, by and large, these are places of work which are going to be stably located. So I think it's an argument that's purely opportunistic.
well, let me just say, I believe the only way we can test the theory is to have the legislature pass a law, just as they did in Los Angeles. I mean, that's the only way it's going to happen. I believe to some degree that, to a substantial degree, in fact, that employment is better than non-employment. The old axiom, the best social program is a job. We supported substantially East River Plaza to the tune of about $55 million in tax-exempt bonds and some debt. 1,000 jobs at East River Plaza. About 75% of those jobs went to people in East Harlem. And for the most part, younger people who have not been introduced to the world of work. I think that's a good thing. It's a floor. It's not a ceiling. But to test the theory of whether or not retail development will be stymied, will be eliminated, I think we've got to see the legislature act, and then we'll see once and for all.
So we're working on it. It is the living wage law is the #1 priority of the Progressive Caucus at this moment. And I am actually reasonably, I mean, it's the one it's the campaign I'm most excited about right now. If you go out here wanting to do something, I would say get involved in 2 campaigns. Go to Living Wage NYC and get involved in the Living Wage campaign, and then get involved in the Real Rent Reform campaign. I'm much more nervous about that one, although I think it's important for many more people because it affects 1 million New York households. On the living wage side, I mean, for starters, let's remember we're only talking about where the city puts subsidy in. That's all the living wage law would affect. We'd say when we allocate scarce subsidy dollars, let's make sure that jobs pay at least $10 an hour. And we'll get plenty of applications for the subsidy. So it's not as though some jobs we'll still spend all the subsidy money. We'll just be doing it on people that are willing to commit to that floor. So, but I think on the politics, I'm actually enthusiastic, and this gets back to what Susan was saying before. There is a good coalition there. Really it's one labor union that gets the credit here. The RWDSU has decided to have kind of a bigger picture point of view on the city. This may or may not help them specifically get more members, but they've really stepped up here. And somehow they made this shidduch, this marriage with a coalition of African-American ministers. I don't know if anyone in the room was at this event at Convent Baptist Church a couple of weeks ago, but I mean, there were 2,000 people in the room, and they weren't all smiles and like, you go Progressive Caucus. They were like, get this done. And so, but that, that's not, I mean, the forces, so labor, kind of the civil rights community, Upper West Side and Park Slope liberals, who I guess I represent, and immigrant organizations. I mean, we have some shared interests, and there's some things we ought to be able to do together. There's a lot of reasons we could go on for why at this moment that coalition is hard to put together. But this is one place where you see some real oomph behind it.
Right.
And I think the answer for the next few months is keep pushing.
Yeah. Chung-Wha, is the immigration coalition?
Yeah, no, I'm
supporting
like
it?
itching to be part. I mean, I think the answer really is coalitions to get stuff done, because the speaker knows the argument. There's a bunch of people who it's not about having the right argument and the rationale and all these myths and facts and stuff. When it's what's in it for you, right? How do you form the coalition that's at the critical mass of political clout that would get things done? And we're at a much better place now than in the past, where we do have a progressive caucus, which I think is huge. Really. And then, it's the first time in the history of the city council that the majority of the members are people of color, immigrants. And I remember we just couldn't get, like 10 years ago, we couldn't even introduce legislation because there were like, 5, half dozen. And when we were working on the minimum wage, the Immigration Coalition was part of a state campaign. 515 is not enough. And there's a great lesson there where it could have been kind of the usual suspects, but what pushed it over was the coalition's ability to bring in immigrants. And of course, when you bring in a constituency, you got to deal with their issues. That in addition to raising the minimum wage, we wanted labor law enforcement, because a lot of our people are like, well, we're not even getting paid the minimum wage. We'd be happy to get the minimum wage. It's unpaid wages. And so we had to try to insert labor law enforcement as the other side of the coin. And, though we didn't get all of what we wanted, we were able to salvage some parts of that. So I think our ability to get stuff done is going to depend more and more around long-lasting coalitions, I think, that really help to shape the political landscape right now, because I think we need to go beyond coalitions that come together on single legislation or little pilot projects or whatever. So we're a coalition in ourselves. We're bringing up 600 people up to Albany on March 1st. So if anybody wants to sign up for it, it would be a great civic experience to see 600 immigrants go up to Albany and talk about revenues, because they don't expect, a bunch of immigrant groups, including, just you can have the gamut, the Russian, Chinese, Dominican, Mexican, everybody. saying we want revenues to fund our programs, and then we want equal access and civil rights, and we have our top 10 agenda. It's hard to keep your base mobilized, but we found that is the only way we have. Every single victory we have ever gotten from the city or from the state was by mobilizing our constituents and speaking with a united voice around a coherent policy agenda. And so we will continue to do that, but it's like day in and day out. I gotta go scraping for raising money, $500 at a time to pay for these buses.
Yeah, and the first lesson of lobbying is not only that lobbying day, but then being present in the weeks and months after that lobbying day.
Before and after,
Is there a question over here?
Hi, my name is Talib Hudson. I'm a student here, an urban policy student here at Milano. I'm also a Harlem resident, and I've experienced some of that culture shock that was mentioned on the panel. And I remember when Harlem USA opened up back in the 90s, and there was a great celebration with Charlie Rangel. And I like being able to go to Staples on 125th Street now, and Starbucks, and it's great, and they have condos next to projects. But yet there's still some of these systemic issues of gangs and children having children, and even more so, a lack of hope amongst people of all age ranges that their lives will be better. And so what I'm wondering is, given the limited scope of government, even if everyone on the council was in the progressive caucus, what can a just city do to tackle some of these longer-term issues that go beyond an election cycle and go beyond, a politician's term?
Well, I don't know if that question was directed at me, but I'll take it. I think, well, what the city can do and what government can do is invest in those things that go to those issues. Education, primarily education, making the school system. And I mean, you also know in Harlem that one of the raging issues now is around charter schools and how charter schools have really become a critical mass in Harlem and what that means. It's probably a good thing that there's a debate in Harlem around charter schools. Because for so many years, for so many generations, the school system failed the children of Harlem. So I don't think that's a bad thing that we're having this debate. But I think all government can do at the end of the day, because you can't legislate human behavior, but you've got to, for its own preservation, for indeed security, national security. We need to continue to invest in those areas that go to the enhancement of human capital, especially in minority communities. And that begins with education, it's health care, and these issues, these very vexing issues of family, maintenance of family. It is the destruction of family that has really exacerbated these issues in our communities, our minority communities. So we've got to look at social policy and how social policy impacts family, because to the degree that these policies impact negatively family structure, then we're going to continue to see those issues recur.
If I could pick up a minute on that, I think there are things that can be done at the local level, and those are the questions I addressed in my book. But the larger issue of income inequality in the United States is not a local issue, it's a national issue. And that unless we, through the national government, have genuine income redistribution, you're going to continue to have poverty. There's a tendency in the social science literature to see poverty as the problem rather than income inequality. But that as long as you have so much going to the top, there is not going to be that much going to the bottom. And I certainly believe in education, and I think that that in that people would be much better off if they were better educated. But you have to realize that the fastest growing jobs in this country are not, in fact, computer analysts or investment banking. It's really low-level service occupations, and that education isn't going to solve the problem of the fact that those jobs are so poorly paid. What we can do here is make them maybe a little better paid, and we can certainly make schools better, although not if we keep cutting the money that goes into education. But that one has to have a national policy towards greater equalization. And when you see countries in Northern Europe, Finland turns out to be the best educated country in the world. It has a quasi-socialist government that you aren't going to get wholesale transformation at the local level.
Yeah. So we need to wrap, but I wanted to ask,
Can I just get
you
one-
can say your thing, but let me just put this on the table. I'd like to hear from each of you. Are we heading in the right direction or the wrong direction? And why? Brad, finish what you were going to say.
I don't want to talk either about Finnish socialism or Harlem charter schools, but one, having said quite a few critical things about the mayor, I want to give him props on gun violence. I mean, I think that's one area where the mayor has taken national leadership and done something you wouldn't have thought maybe a mayor would do, and substantially reduced gun violence in New York City and around the country. And that's an example of where leadership can make a difference on social policy. I wish both the mayor and the president have wanted to really, invest in and hold up the Harlem Children's Zone and Jeff Canada and say, let's invest in that model of reaching young people and reaching families. I was hoping we would both put more money in it and hear more about it as part of both the Obama and the Bloomberg administrations. And I think, unfortunately, some of that's kind of gotten driven into the charter school debate rather than what do you do from 0 to 5? How do you engage families? With relevant resources. So. I think we're headed in the wrong direction.
Yeah. Chung-Wha?
You mean the city, state,
Yeah,
federal?
New York City. New York City.
New York City, because we have to deal with triple whammy. The beginning of the year is so hard because you're getting the State of the Union, State of the State, the city, and the executive budgets rolling out. Anyway, so I think it's a more complicated than right or wrong direction right now. I think in terms of how our political leaders are reacting to the budget cuts, I think is the wrong direction. It's actually being used to gut progress like Campaign for Fiscal Equity that's supposed to drive and fix our inability to give sound and basic education. It basically guts historic kind of achievements like that by stretching out the payment over 10 years, right, in education. So I think the budget cuts and how the resource question is being handled is just really, really going in the wrong direction, but we're not accepting. Actually, I'd like to respectfully disagree that the revenues is not on the table. That's what people said 2-3 years ago, and we got it on the table, and we passed it. So we're going to do it again. That's why we're going to Albany. For better or worse, I think sometimes people, if you can't give resources, I think they are forced to confront other policy questions of access, which has kind of utility in being able to leverage federal funding and so on. If you have full usage of some of the income support programs, or if you're being forced to, revamp a workforce development system, which is completely not working, because even by whoever conservative or liberal standards, if you're not placing people in jobs and training them, we're not getting economic growth. And so I think there are plenty of opportunities for us to implement the principle of justice so that we get our both kind of the raising the floor types of stuff, such as the living wage or and just protecting the gains that we've had during better times, such as rent regulations and other New York City for immigrants, some of the executive orders around equal access, and the mayor has been great on immigration reform and helping to put that in the right perspective. But it does raise the fundamental question about, today's New York Times story talked about the new statistics that came out from the regions, that show, among other things, charter schools produced only 10% of charter school graduates are college ready. Only 23% of the graduates are college ready. And so I think we have these huge systems that we have to kind of have a vision for as we work towards incremental progress toward that vision. And there, I think we don't have enough of a commitment, whether it's housing, education, or healthcare, that I think we are still stuck at the kind of the gimmicky, a lot of the stuff is kind of one-shot kinds of deals. And so I think we have to do much better, and I would love to, talk to more people about how to make some of these justice standards translate that into real, legislation and regulations and moral standards that's publicly acceptable.
Right. Ken?
Well, I agree with Chung, right?
Chung-Wha.
Chung-Wha. It is not a question of proper direction. I think it's much more complex than that. I think we're in a tough place right now, and tough choices will have to be made. We will maybe have to go backwards before we go forward. Backwards in the sense that some sacrifices are going to have to be made across the board. But the equity should come also should be a part of the sacrifices. It can't be disproportionate to the least of ye, and it's going to have to be made across the board. I think by and large the instincts of New York, and I can only speak for New York, over the years have been essentially good instincts. But I think we're at a moment of challenge and a real moment of crisis, and how we handle this will depend to a significant degree what the future looks like.
Susan?
One of the things that puzzles me is why during the Great Depression the politics was so different, that was when the safety net was created to the extent that the United States has one. So it was also a period where resources were certainly scarce, where Herbert Hoover went around saying you had to cut the budget. There was a very virulent right wing that existed, and it was racist, it was anti-Semitic, and it was anti-poor. But nevertheless, there was a strong enough coalition on the left to see the beginning of Social Security, of labor laws, of the Wagner Act for public housing, and so forth. And I agree that one doesn't want to make a generalization saying we're headed in the right or wrong direction, and it is more complex. And New York does some things quite well, gun control being one. New York is better at absorbing immigrants than the European countries, but the whole view that sacrifice means, we all have to sacrifice, so that means we throw the poor off the edge, and the people who are making $5 billion are somehow don't have to sacrifice at all because we need them to create jobs, is to me a very bizarre form of logic. So it's a depressing point in American politics, although on the other hand, it's also a period where people are beginning to talk about justice much more, and perhaps that means that we're going to begin to see some kind of turnaround.
Right. Well, I'm happy to say I see some sunlight coming out from behind the curtains. The weather report is good for the rest of the week. So we're headed in the right direction. Thanks you so much for coming. Thanks to the panel and to Susan Fainstein. There are copies of the book, The Just City, over on the table over there if you want to buy one. See you next time.